There, I see it. All right, thanks a lot for joining us today. We are going to cover the cost of establishment and maintenance over a 10-year period for a native versus an introduced field. And the way this all came about is we get a lot of phone calls with people asking if they want to renovate a given piece of property. Should they plant it in native plants or in introduced plants? And I know I have my biases, and so I wanted to put a pencil to the paper and look at the economics behind this. So we joined up with Mac Young, who is an economist with the Farm Services Division of our Extension Service. Mac runs a model regularly looking at risk for people's businesses. And so this model is in practice every week, helping people to decipher whether or not they can add a child to a business or buy a piece of equipment or change their production methods and whether or not that's worth it to them or not. And so we utilized Mac's model for our little scenario. And also Dr. Larry Redman, Extension Forage specialist, he helped a lot with putting together numbers and what might be a common scenario for different people. And also got a lot of help from people such as Dr. Jamie Foster with Texas AgriLife Research and Forrest Smith with South Texas Natives. So I sure appreciate everyone chiming in and helping us to get some fairly realistic numbers given it's a model. So we want to look a bit today about why we would be looking to plant introduced or natives and then what that showed when we ran our numbers. So what plants to plant? That's our common question. And usually the first thing I shoot back at people is, well, what is your goals for your property? We really need to know your goals in order to make a good recommendation for what types of plants you might want to put in the ground there. And also, along with those goals, I always stress you have to have measurable objectives. If you do not have measurable objectives, then there's nothing to go back at the end of the year and really test whether you were successful or not. So say your goal is to make money off of livestock on your property. A measurable objective might be to increase your income from livestock by 10% that year. And that's something that you can go back and see if you actually accomplished or not as compared to the year before. And I say they must be written, and that's because it doesn't seem like goals are very solid until you have them written down in an organized format. So that's why the written part, even though I think a lot of people know in their head what they want to do, but when you go to make a decision, it's nice to look at something concrete and say, does this decision match my goals and objectives, or am I veering off of what my main desire for my property might be? Second is, what are you willing to sacrifice? Because whether you plant natives or introduced species, you're going to have some pros and cons both ways. So knowing what you're willing to live without would really be helpful. For instance, if you really want to still run livestock but also have prime wildlife habitat, you might be needing to be willing to reduce your stocking rate to a lower or moderate stocking rate level in order to keep that beneficial habitat for wildlife. So typically in life, there's always trade-offs, and that definitely applies when we talk about restoring a piece of property. So our first quiz today, let's see if I can remember how to pull this up. Do you have written goals for your property? So if y'all would answer for me either yes, no, or can't remember. Do you actually have goals written down? Okay, so we're looking like actually not too bad, about half and half, but more people towards the no side, which I think is pretty typical. Don't feel bad if you don't. A lot of people don't have goals written down, and when you don't, it's just really hard to come back and say you were successful or not. And I think that's an important thing to know. Um, oh, I just maximized instead of hiding it. There we go. All right, so once we have our goals written down, there's something for us to look at, and that goes for all aspects of life. Even if you're thinking, well, I don't exactly own property, if you don't have goals for what you want to accomplish that year, it's really hard to know at the end of the year if you made it or not. All right, instead of beating that dead horse, we'll talk a bit about why in the world would you want to plant native plants? One reason, of course, is to increase your plant diversity. When we plant an introduced grass species, it's typically because it's a grass that's going to grow really, really well. and take over an area and produce even when we graze it hard or during drought years. Typically, they survive a bit better. But on the other hand, you typically only have that one grass species because it does so well, it tends to crowd out a lot of the other diversity that you would typically have in that field. So when we plant natives, we're talking about planting a dozen or even more plant species, and so you maintain that plant diversity. Why is that important? Well, different plants provide different things, such as food or cover for our wildlife species or even livestock. So having plant diversity sort of lowers your risk. During certain times of the year, certain plants may be doing better than the other, or some may be more green than the other. And then, of course, during times of drought or heavy rains, you'll see some plants who just seem to excel in those conditions. And so having a diversity sort of lowers your risk overall and maintains some type of plant cover on the land. They're also adapted for the climate. So we're going to look at our scenarios and you'll see right off that one huge benefit of natives is that because you're planting plants that are meant to be there on those soils and that weather, there's typically lower inputs. So you're not looking at fertilizing natives or spraying weeds, that sort of thing. You're maintaining something more in its native ecological state. So you can fertilize natives, but the increase in growth that you would get from a native field is so low that it's not really typically worth the cost of putting fertilizer down. So in that way, we manage natives knowing that this is our maximum output, but that we don't have to put a lot of inputs into it. Another reason that you might want to plant natives is because they benefit wildlife and livestock. A lot of people feel like an introduced grass species is best for their livestock, and although it may grow more production over time, it may not actually fit both a wildlife and a livestock scheme. So once you have that diversity, you open up the possibility of also having wonderful wildlife habitat and at the same time grazing those grasses, because many of our native grasses evolved with herbivores grazing on them, and they do really well under that type of pressure. So they can benefit both. That's one mistake that a lot of people make when they're trying to decide between natives and introduced grasses. Also, they're non-invasive. So typically, not all the time, but typically our native plants are meant for that area, and so they tend to play well with others, I like to say. So they'll maintain that plant diversity on your landscape. They're not going to take over like an introduced grass species would. If everybody would picture in their minds, like on the side of the road where we see KR or King Ranch bluestem or Clayburgh bluestem, those old worlds, those grasses that are not meant to be here necessarily, they were brought in, they're a little bit more invasive. So they tend to take over an area, and that's where you lose your plant diversity. And finally, the aesthetics and natural beauty. I always laugh because this time of year, everybody talks about the beautiful wildflowers. Everybody's posting on Facebook pictures of their kids and the wildflowers on the sides of the roads or in their pastures. And then here in another month or two, I'm going to start getting some phone calls about how to kill weeds, because these things that are beautiful right now will soon turn to a weed because they'll lose their flowers. So people wonder how to get rid of them. So definitely natives are what provides our natural aesthetics for our area, and I think they can definitely be very beautiful. So then that leads you to think, well, then why would you bother planting an introduced grass if you think you might be interested in wildlife? Well, when someone's trying to establish plants on an area, introduced species establish quickly. It's not necessarily true that they are the only ones that will establish well, but they're definitely quick to establish. That's why they've been selected for such purposes. They also may be less expensive to plant, and a lot of times this just goes back to supply and demand. So it's a little bit tougher to grow these native seeds in confinement, and so there's a limited supply of natives, so therefore they can bring a higher price than some of these introduced grass species that are easy to grow and easy to harvest their seeds. That I think is changing just a little bit, and we'll see that there's not a huge difference, at least from what I was expecting, in the cost to establish natives versus introduced. But you do have a little bit less expensive seed on the introduced grass species. Also, they have the potential to grow more pounds of forage. So it's no surprise that if you have a really thick field full of an introduced grass that's growing very well and can take the abuse from possibly high numbers of grazing, that they would produce more forage. But with that caveat, you'll see that we had to combine fertilizer, weed control, and insecticide into our scenario. And oftentimes there's forages that do best under irrigation. And for the most part, Texas is not real friendly towards the ability to be able to irrigate. We have a lot of water management issues. So if that is a situation for you, then all the better. But a lot of people, when they're faced with deciding what to do when they're restoring a pasture, don't have that option. Also introduce, you can usually graze more intensely. Like I said, our natives were made to be grazed, but you cannot abuse them for sure. And you can't abuse introduced grass species either, but you can usually graze them a bit shorter and they will return the following spring. But you may also need to think about cutting your numbers during times of drought, just like you would on a native field. Another thing is there's one species, so you're managing for a monoculture, and some people just like this, whether they hay the field or not. It's easier for them to treat all of the weeds in the pasture, whereas when you plant native grass mix, you're planting forbs and grasses typically, and those forbs are super important for holding that soil structure, adding organic matter back into our soil. But on the same token, you're not going to spray that field with something like P plus D or 2,4-D because you're going to kill all of your broadleaf forbs. So some people find it easier to maintain and manage a field that has one species, which we call monoculture. So why would you plant? And if you're tuning into this webinar, I would assume that you have some reason in mind that you've thought about planting one of your fields from some time or another. But a lot of times people call if there's land that was previously farmed and they're wanting to restore that back into productive landscape. They're not farming anymore. Maybe they bought a piece of property that had been farmed and they're just not farmers. So they want to do something that they could either graze livestock on or hunt recreationally. Maybe the native seed bank is absent, and that might go back to when it had been farmed. They turn that soil surface over. When your topsoil is no longer on top, you lose a lot of your free native seed. So without that free native seed there, you might be thinking about what you want to plant to restore that vegetative cover on your soil surface. Slow vegetation recovery, maybe after you've done some management project, you're concerned that the vegetation isn't coming back as fast as you would like, and you want to prevent soil erosion. So having plants on the soil surface helps to maintain the soil in its place and also to help that rain infiltrate into our subsoil layers where that subsoil moisture can later be used. So definitely having plant cover is beneficial in many ways for our soils. Also, you might want to limit the weedy or invasive plant species. So when you have an area that has been opened up for bare ground, that leaves space to where some plants nearby, such as that old world blue stem, might be able to establish seed there and germinate and take over that area. So once you have plant coverage, it's harder for the sunlight to reach the ground, which will help germinate those seeds. So keeping some sort of plant cover could limit your weedy or invasive plants. Also, you could improve your plant diversity, structure, or composition, just like we talked about with the native plants. You could really seed and add in some plants that used to be there in the past and maybe had been overgrazed and removed from that plant community. Really neat things that you could do by adding in some plants as long as they're meeting that same soil and weather conditions that they grow well in. Also, you could increase your forage for livestock, especially if you're thinking about planting an introduced grass species. There's no buts about it. You could increase the amount of forage available from one season to the next for your livestock. So that might be a reason you're thinking about planting. Another thing that you could say is because I have too much money, and I put that in there tongue in cheek, when really that's not an ideal situation, but sometimes people start to plant and maybe they don't necessarily need to be planting. So we always want to evaluate individual situations and decide ahead of time if it's really worth spending the money on planting, because you're about to see that it's quite an investment to restore land through the planting process. So if there's a chance that through proper management, a lot of native species might come back, or plants that are there might be able to increase their root potential and grow back or spring back in a way, we may not want to plant. We might want to hold off for a year or two and see what the natural environment does, especially given maybe a good rain year if you're coming out of a drought condition. So here's a little bit about this risk management system. So first of all, it's a model. So hopefully there's no economists on the webinar today, but models are very tricky because it's what you put into them that gets you your answers. So if you don't put accurate numbers into a model, you can really vary your results. And so we're going to go through the actual numbers that we used for this model so you can see very transparently how we ran this. But again, we had to make a lot of assumptions and a lot of averages. So it may vary for your situation, and keep in mind that's going to highly vary the output that comes out of this. We assumed 100% land ownership, and that's just because when we come up with our scenario, it's really tough to say, well, this person's still paying a note and they owe so much on their land, or this person's still paying on their note but they own so much of their land. It really varies your output, and so to eliminate that, across the board in every scenario, we assume that you outright owned your land or maybe you inherited your property. We entered custom rates for land tillage, planting, and spraying. So some people might be able to spray with their own equipment, but custom rates allows for us to think if we had to have somebody come in and do everything themselves, or accounts for the wear and tear on that equipment that you're using. A lot of times when people feel like they're making money off of their land, they're leaving out a lot of variables that are really important, such as the depreciation on their equipment that they're using day in and day out, the gas to drive out to their property if they don't live there. There's a lot of things to consider, and one of those ways we eliminated the variation is by using custom rates for everything. When we replaced cows or bought cows, we replaced them with bred cows, just a note. Also, there's a lot of vaccination, supplementation, pregnancy testing, everything that the Extension Service stresses you should do in order to run a clean, healthy herd. We added that into the model. We also incorporated a really low labor charge when we're working cattle, because most of the time you're going to need help if you have any number of cattle. So our annual cow variable cost was about $550 to $600 per cow. I don't have the exact number for you. I could add that up, but that's a pretty good ballpark. And that's just the amount of money that it takes per year to maintain a healthy cow that would hopefully give you a calf. So let's look a little bit more about what we thought for our scenario. We're pretending that we have a 2,000 acre ranch in Live Oak County, which would be like George West, Texas. We're concentrating mostly on this 250 acre pasture that's up for renovation. So make whatever type of scenario you want in your mind, but for some reason there's 250 acres that we really want to renovate and make better. The one, when I went on to Web Soil Survey, which is through the USDA NRCS, I chose a random area that looked like rangeland in Live Oak County. The majority of that land was fine sandy loam. So that is the type of soil that we're talking about. What we do will vary slightly depending on soil, so we'll talk about that as the situation comes up. But for the most part, that's a pretty average type of soil that you might think about replanting. Okay, so we had 7 scenarios, and it's really not as confusing as it kind of looks, but we had native plantings, we had buffle grass plantings, and then we sprigged Tifton 85, which is a very productive Bermuda grass that does really well in this area around Live Oak County. So within the native seedings, we looked at what would happen if you grazed it with your own cattle, or if you leased out that 250 acre pasture for grazing to somebody else. So they would bring in their own cattle. The same thing for buffle grass seeding. It was either grazed or leased out for grazing. And then Tifton, we did the same thing of grazing or leasing out for grazing, but we added a third scenario where you might hay your Tifton field, your 250 acre Tifton field. Okay, so hopefully everybody's with me. Field prep. This is a really hard thing to get good numbers on, because the field preparation, of course, is determined by what type of plants you have there now and what you need to remove before you could successfully plant. For the most part, you want to start with a clean field for either planting natives or introduced grass species. Yes, there are situations where you might want to just enhance the diversity of, say, a native field, and you might just go in and overseed what's already there. But for our scenarios, we assume the same field preparation for every single one. So we thought that it's probably just covered with some weeds and some grasses that have been there for some time, maybe productive, maybe not. But we sprayed all of it with 5 quarts of glyphosate, which is what the recommendation is to kill a Bermuda grass. So say you were going to change a Bermuda grass pasture back over to natives, it would definitely take 5 quarts. So we went ahead and assumed that for everyone for the first round. That $13.70 per acre includes a $7 per acre application fee, which is about what it costs if you were to, say, get a company like Helena to come in and spray. We also assume disking 3 times, and a lot of scenarios you might get away with double disking, where you would just go one way with the disc and then the opposite direction. But then for introduced grass species, sometimes you need to disc up to 4 or 5 times. So our assumption was 3. It costs about $12 per acre each time that you disc. And then right before we seeded, we decided to spray with 5 quarts of glyphosate again at another $13.70. If you pretty well kill out everything the first go around, you could drop your rate of glyphosate. But field prep is so important because that keeps you from having a lot of trouble later on after you've already got your seeds that you want in the ground. So in order to decrease our follow-up need, I went ahead and kept that at 5 quarts per acre, hitting it again, making sure we got really good coverage. So it cost us almost $40 per acre just to prepare the field. So that's going to vary. If you have brush in there, you're going to need to start spraying your brush a year or two before you plan to plant. So that's going to be something that's going to delay your 10-year period. And since the model just reads out 10 years, we decided to take brush out of the equation because that would eat up 2 of our 10 years. But just know if you do have that scenario, you want to plan ahead and start getting rid of the brush ahead of time. And your costs may be higher, or you may not have to spray with quite as much glyphosate or even disc that many times. But we're going to assume $39.40 per acre for field prep. Okay, then when we go to planting, we got, of course, custom numbers for seed and equipment. So that's yes, if we hired out completely, but keep in mind that even if you have your own equipment, you need to be considering that that's some type of wear and tear and some maintenance costs to keep up that equipment. Some of you know all too well how much time and effort you keep in maintaining your tractors and shredders and such. So our custom numbers for a native field, we did a 22 seed mix at $82 per acre. This seed mix could vary greatly, but that's about an average. We broadcasted the seed and packed it for $25 per acre for a total of $107 per acre in order to plant the native field. For buffle grass, we seeded 4 pounds of pure live seed per acre, which would cost $63.70 per acre. Some of the buffle grass companies would suggest you put out quite a bit more seed, but we also have situations where you could put out half as much of that seed and it be successful. So we felt like 4 was a good average. We broadcasted and packed and just assumed that the same $25 per acre charge for $88.70 to establish a nice buffle grass field. Tifton 85 typically is sprigged, and so we assumed the sprigging with the plant costs $135 per acre. And then a recommendation from a specialist who wrote a publication on Tifton 85 said that they prefer that you come back and spray 2,4-D in order to eliminate any broadleaf weeds that may have come up 30 days after planting. So we figured in another $16 per acre, which again includes a $7 per acre application fee. So total to establish the Tifton 85 Bermuda grass, it was about $151. Okay, so you can see right now our different custom numbers for each of those plantings, and then we'll move on over to maintenance. So again, we're talking about maintenance for a 10-year period. So natives for grazing, we did spot spraying brush every year because inevitably you're going to have some brush plants come up. So we just did a stem spray as soon as those brush species would come up and followed that up yearly. We assumed 25 plants per acre, which is estimated $7.50 per acre, which includes a $12 per hour labor charge. So if you did it yourself, you would eliminate some of that labor as well. But if you thought in that your time is worth some money, we decided to include it. For the first 2 years, we went with the 25 plants per acre, but over time, you're going to start reducing the number of plants that come up as your field gets established and those seeds are covered from the sunlight and not able to germinate as readily. So after that, we cut our number of plants we had to treat in half for the next 2 years and then cut it in half again for the remainder of the 10 years. So treating spot spraying for natives cost $33.78 per acre over that entire 10-year period. For buffle grass, we did the same brush control treatments as the natives, but we also sprayed weeds with Grassland L, which is what's replacing Grazon P plus D, more of a high load version. We did that every 3 years. So we didn't spray weeds every year because buffle grass pretty much is self-maintaining, but we did include that $16 per acre charge every 3rd year. In a heavier soil, you might need to add in something for aeration. It's been shown that with buffle grass, when you aerate, it really helps spur this grass on to maintain good coverage throughout the field. But given that we had a sandy loam soil that I chose, we did not add in a cost for aeration. So buffle grass came out to $97.78 per acre over the 10-year period. When we look at the Tifton 85, when we're grazing it for livestock, we did put in to spray weeds with Grassland L every year. That's typical for a Bermuda grass field. We would fertilize the first year with a heavier concentration of nitrogen, phosphorus, and potassium, which would cost $62 per acre. And then thereafter, because you're grazing it, once we return that livestock to the land, they are sort of cycling and putting a lot of the fertilizer back onto the property for us through their fecal material and urine. And so we dropped that to 50 pounds of nitrogen per acre per year, which is pretty typical for this county. So that was a $26 per acre charge. And then we went ahead and put in to spray every 3 years for insects. If you're hoping to get high production off of your Bermuda grass, that's not unheard of. And our entomologist helped me out and said, typically people are, if they're spraying a Tifton field, it would be for fall armyworms with a pyrethroid, and that would cost $9.50 per acre with the $7 per acre application fee. So the chemical itself is super cheap. And again, we suggested doing that every 3 years or assumed every 3 years. So for an introduced Tifton field, the maintenance was $516 over the 10-year period per acre. When you talk about haying, you're going to need to spray weeds more often because we'll be haying possibly every 6 weeks during the growing period. So we're spraying weeds with Grassland L at least twice a year. That would not be unheard of. That's going to cost $32 per acre. We'll be fertilizing with the higher amount because remember, when you hay, you're farming those nutrients out of the ground. So when you take that hay off, you're taking your nutrients, and so it's important that you're returning that back to your land. So we assume the higher rates of 250 nitrogen, 125 pounds of phosphorus, and 60 pounds of potassium for $62 per acre. Finally, we decided we would still spray about every 3 years for insects. So we added in that $9.50 per acre charge for a total of $978 for introduced. So just to recap, for introduced for haying, costs about $9.78 per acre. Introduced for grazing, $5.16. Buffle grass was only $97 and natives only $34. So that's maintenance. So that's the big draw for a native field, is that you have a much lower input cost as compared to something like Tifton 85 Bermuda grass. Okay, so let's look at our yields or our output. So that's what we put into our business, but what would we be taking out of this 250 acres? So in a native mix, we rested the area for 2 years. So we brought in cattle after 2 years. We had to assume that we bought these cattle. And so that hurt us a lot on our investment charge because we had to purchase these cattle. But if we took them from another piece of the property, the model would have to figure in some sort of leasing from ourself rate since we're looking at a self-contained 250 acres. So to eliminate that, we just assumed purchasing the cattle bred. We assumed 50% stocking rate after the first 2 years, and then we bumped that up to 75% of the potential stocking rate for years 5 through 10. You might ask, why not 100% stocking rate? But we've run a lot of these different models and tests and scenarios, and consistently they've shown that maintaining your maximum stocking at a 75% carrying capacity actually lowers your risk long term because you're not worried about buying hay as much in drier years or finding cows to take up that forage during the years that you do have good rain. There's a lot of benefits to maintaining a 75% potential stocking rate, so that's where we left it. The area, that sandy loam that we found, produces under native conditions with all the natural plants that should be on that property. It could, on an average year, yield 3,000 pounds of forage per acre. And if we assume 25% of that would be available for forage for our livestock, that's 750 pounds per acre. Where did I get that 25% rate? So when you have your total plant growth, we say leave half of that as stubble in order to maintain a healthy root system, help rain infiltrate, hold the soil surface, lots of benefits, maintain that organic matter returning back to the soil after that plant goes dormant. There's good reason to leave 50% of that forage, standing crop forage, every year. And then 25% of that we found is actually gone thanks to trampling and insects. So we assume 25% of that forage is available for our livestock. Therefore, over that period, going up to 75% of our potential stocking rate, the maximum number of cows that we ran on that 250 acres of native forage is 12 cows. So we assumed a 90% calf crop when we grazed our own, and we assumed $150 per head if we were to lease out that land. So then let's look at buffle grass. So for buffle, it was grazed after only 1 year of deferment, so that allowed that plant to grow up, to seed out, and return those seeds to the soil. So kind of gave us some free seeds in addition. And then after that, we ran 100% stocking rate. So we did not do the 75% lower rate that we suggested for natives. We assumed you could run as many cows as that would support. We assumed that buffle grass would give us more like 4,500 pounds of forage per acre, and that's compared to the 3,000 we could carry with our native mixture. We took 50% of that forage that was produced instead of 25%. We thought we could graze buffle grass a little bit harder because it tends to be hardier, and you're not worried about grazing out your better grasses because it's all going to be buffle grass under our assumptions. So at the end of the day, it was 50 cows max. We assumed that same 90% calf crop and $150 per head for a lease. Okay, Tifton 85. I hope y'all are all still with me. It's a lot of numbers. At Tifton 85, we still deferred after 1 year, although they say when you sprig Tifton, it really starts to grow right away. But it's advised that you leave that for a full growing season in order to seed out and return those seeds to your soil. So you're just bettering your field if you'll wait for 1 year, and then after that we assumed 100% stocking rate. So our assumption was that Tifton could produce 5,000 pounds per acre, and we could take even more than we did on buffle. We used 65% of the forage produced because it is a fast growing grass. That would be about 3,250 pounds per acre, and at its maximum, after we built up, that would be 72 cows. We assumed, again, the same 90% calf crop and $150 per head lease charge. Now in our hayed scenario, we hayed it after 1 year. So we still allowed those plants to seed out for 1 year and then came back and hayed it. It yielded 9,000 pounds of forage per acre for hay, and the hay was valued at $100 per ton, which is where it is right now. This model, I should say, also will project calf prices, and it projects hay values as they change over a 10-year period. So it figures in kind of how the economies change. So what we're looking at here is net cash farm income. And for all you people like me who are not economists, you're like, okay, what does that mean? This means your average income each year over this 10-year period. So some years, of course, will get better than others, especially after you've paid off a lot of the inputs, such as planting and buying cattle. But this is your average per year for 10 years. This is all of your operating in and outflows. So everything that it costs you to put into your business, including, I think we assume $5 per acre for taxes, and everything that you get out of the land, such as your calves or your grazing lease or your hay. This also includes adjustments for cattle depreciation over time. So you buy them young, they're going to depreciate. You can't sell them for exactly the same cost. It takes into consideration custom rates, so we're not so worried about depreciation on our equipment, but it does have the cattle depreciation in there. And some of you are probably like, what in the world? Because when I got the results back, I saw that pretty much every scenario for us to restore this 250 acres was negative, meaning that you're not making money off of this 250 acres with the businesses that we put in, except in the case of hay. And so I called Dr. Larry Redmond. He's our forage specialist that's on this project. And I said, Larry, under this scenario, why wouldn't everyone make hay? And he's like, well, it's like the saying, make hay, you know. When everyone can make hay, there's plenty of hay available. And so hay is not typically worth that much during those years. And when you really need hay, you typically can't make as much hay. So the hay business is a little bit tricky in that the supply and demand is dependent highly upon the weather. When you look at the grazed scenarios, you can see that both native and buffle came out a lot less than the Tifton, and that's simply because Tifton has a lot of maintenance needs as far as especially the fertilizer. That's probably what got us the most is the fertilizer costs. And again, we were assuming the lower rate of fertilizer because those cows were on it and turning out a lot of those nutrients back into the soil themselves. When you look at the lease situations, it's a little bit better case. So you see that our negative isn't quite as negative, and that's because you're not taking on the cost of the cattle. So some of you might say, well, if I renovated this 250 acres, I would move cows from my other property onto this 250 acres. Absolutely. So that in that scenario, you would not be seeing the loss as hard, but you still have an investment in those cattle, and you have an investment in the forage that they're eating right now on the other land. So you are sort of still taking money, borrowing from one to take to another when you look at the costs per pasture. So again, they're all fairly negative, and the hay situation is what really brought in the money. You can tell that the inputs is really what got some of the negativity, and to put that much money into the establishment, if you'll think back to the planting slides that we looked at, the cost to plant is very high, and so you had to spread that out over those 10 years, the cost that you invested. And that's a lot of money. So when you're going to plant, that's why I say unless you've just got tons of money to burn, you really want to make sure you know your goals and your reason for planting, because it could quickly get away from you, and you might find yourself not benefiting from what you've done for that property as much as you thought you would. So what will be the future use of my land? Let me pull up this poll real quick. All right, so if you'll answer, would you use this land for livestock grazing, wildlife? You think your land that you're thinking about renovating would later probably be subdivided or developed, or are you undecided? Some of you are like, you've been talking about numbers, so I'm just waking up. I understand. Okay. All right. Looks like pretty much everybody's chimed in here. Um, I'm happy to see that there's so many people under wildlife, because what this model did not incorporate, and we chose not to add it in, is the value for wildlife. But we could talk for a very long time about the amount of lease you might get, say $8 to $12 per acre for a wildlife lease, or even better if you did individual hunts, say dove weekend hunts, or added in special deer hunts. There's ways that you could recover a lot of the costs for maintaining a field. And typically when we talk about prime wildlife land, we're talking about natives, and so not necessarily introduced. And so that might be a huge reason that those 10 of you would lean towards planting a native field, regardless of what my economics that I ran in this model say as far as cattle use. Although cattle are a really great way to manage native land, and so if you bring in a lower number of cattle and use them as a tool for maintaining prime wildlife, you can still sell their calves and increase your profits in that way as well. So that might be a win-win, but again, we did not add wildlife in because we could have made up any number we wanted to kind of make up for that deficit, and it just didn't seem very fair. But that is a definite consideration. For livestock grazing, the future use for livestock grazing, it looks dismal because it's so expensive not only to buy in, but also you just don't make enough money off of those cows. Now, costs for cows have really been high lately, but they seem like they're declining. And so that was figured into the model. So who knows? It's kind of a gamble when you're in a business like that. Some of you said subdivided or developed. That's the best way to probably earn back money from land, kind of depressing for those of us who like to manage properties. But also when you're thinking that you might sell it even as a ranch, I bet I need to call and get exact numbers, but my heavy bets are on the fact that if you were to sell a property that's a native state, that it would bring more money than improved or introduced grasses, just because a lot of the people who are purchasing these properties probably are not purchasing them in order to maintain a really large cattle herd. They're probably buying these properties for recreational value, and therefore your natives are going to be what you want to establish and what's going to look pretty to them on your landscape. Okay, moving on. So how do I convert? So we don't have time in this presentation to go through how to actually do the planting, but I do want to hit on some points, such as, will you want the ag or the wildlife tax valuation? How much that tax valuation is worth is variable by county, so it's important that you go talk to them about their requirements and what that could do for your bottom line when you're making that decision if you're undecided. Of course, wildlife tax valuation is more plausible if you have natives on your field. So something else to consider when you're trying to decide what to restore a piece of property back to. Also, it's typically easier if you go from natives to introduced. So if you have a native field, you could change that into an introduced field. When you try to go back the other way, it's kind of like trying to take a problem plant out of your landscape and replace it with native plants who have a hard time competing during tough years. So multiple glyphosate applications may be needed to actually get rid of those introduced plants. But it can be done. So it is something worthwhile if you're interested in doing that in order to meet your land goals. Sometimes it's suggested that a cover crop be planted if you're trying to get that area covered during unlikely planting times. So for that, I mean, if it's not during our spring rains or our fall rains, you might want to consider putting in a cover crop. If you do get something to come up in the summer or in the winter, it's going to be a big attractant for wildlife. So likely, even if you keep your cattle out of the pasture, something's going to be attracted to your green you're growing and go over there. So putting a cover crop to hold those soils during that time is a great idea, especially if you've already got things ready to go and it's just not ideal planting season. And finally, before you make a decision, I always encourage people to consider the composition of their nearby fields. If you have an invasive grass species nearby and you're trying to maintain something as natives and you're going to spend a lot of investment into getting natives, That time when your native field is still dirt and you're planting is very susceptible to those seeds from nearby areas. So you may want to consider leaving a buffer area before you plant, or thinking about how you want to arrange things so that field does not encroach on what you're trying to establish. And honestly, the same thing goes even if you're trying to establish an introduced grass species like our Tifton or Buffle. If you have something like King Ranch bluestem in the pasture right next door, you may not want to bald the land right up to the fence line in order to plant, because KR bluestem can take over a buffle grass field as well. So it's just something to consider. Make sure you're looking at the entire scenario. Even though this model focused on that 250 acres, it's hard to talk about anything ecological within one silo. We really have to look at the whole area to make our decision soundly. So what plant species are best adapted? Well, that depends on your ecological site. That's the climate and the soils together of what might do well on your property. A few things you could do is contact your local county extension office. A lot of times they have resources, or they can direct you to us that could get you resources on what would be best to plant depending on your soils and where you are. Also, your local USDA NRCS office could help you, but they have that web soil survey tool, or Soil Web, which is the app accompaniment of Web Soil Survey. When you go into the ecological sites, it'll actually give you a list of plants you would typically find on that property. So that might be a good place to start as far as starting to investigate what type of plants may do well. But keep in mind, when you buy or purchase plants, you're purchasing a certain variety, and you want to make sure that variety is conducive for your area. You could always check with local successful neighbors with reputations as good land stewards. So I say that with caution, because if your neighbor is doing something that's not in line with your goals, that's probably not a good way to go. I've also had people come up to me after presentations and tell me that the best thing for their area is this one mix from a certain commercial plant place. And I ask them further digging how their success is, and they say it has not been successful. Well, then that one mix is probably not what you want to get. So definitely look for successful people who've done what you want to do, and then see if you can copy them as long as you have similar situations. Also not on here, if you're in certain areas of the state, South Texas Natives has a great website. If you'll just Google South Texas Natives, they have seeding recommendations for native plants. But of course, your county extension office or NRCS office would be great for recommending what introduced grass species may do well in your area. Okay. And there's my email address in case y'all have questions later, or you want more information about any of the resources that I presented. But hopefully that gives you a good overview of how to go about thinking about natives versus introduced. And I do apologize for the numbers being so negative, but I double checked this with a number of other studies, and it just looks like getting in the cow business and maintaining fields like that is just really not a very profitable business. And so kudos to those of you who are able to run livestock operations profitably. Please make sure when you do your books that you're accounting for all of the inputs that you put into your property, because I think a lot of times we run it more as a hobby to where we're not considering everything as a full picture. But absolutely, even if you're interested in wildlife, please don't forget that livestock, especially in low to moderate stocking rates, can be very beneficial as a tool for managing for prime wildlife habitat. I guess with that, Pete, I could take some questions.
Thank you, Dr. Clayton. Any questions, y'all feel free to type them out. And I see some questions coming in, so as they type them out, let me just say that surveys won't pop up in your browser. Please complete the survey, and I'll also going to put the link in this on here. If it doesn't pop up, just click on the link. Okay, you have a question there from Chris.
Chris, is a written report available to share with landowners? Yes, we are working on turning this into an extension publication, and that will be posted on our website. But if you would email me your, I'll type my email in again. If you'll email me your address, then I'll make a note to myself when that's available to try to get that to you, because it'll be a little while by the time we get it all written up. We just ran these numbers last week and then get that published through our ag communications. Clayton. Okay. Forrest Smith. Megan was in and out, but any plans to rerun the analyses with hunting lease income included? Forrest, actually, I didn't realize Forrest was on here. Forrest Smith is the director of South Texas Natives that I mentioned. Forrest, we could easily run this with the hunting lease included. Um, Definitely not a problem. In fact, for our publications, we would like to do that to be able to say, here's another scenario. So I may even chat with you about what would be a fair number to assume for land like that in Live Oak County. It just got convoluted, like if you wanted to run individual type hunts or lease out per acre, which I think would be more in line with what we've done with the grazing. And also, a lot of times when you have neighboring areas that are also great for wildlife, that adds to the value for your place. So we got to come up with some kind of number, but I'll be getting with you on that.
I see Megan's typing another question. There it is.
Oh, another Megan. Okay. I was like, oh, I'm
Yes.
not typing. Hi, other Megan. I'm having trouble with American Beauty berry bush dominating my back 40. What might be best to compete with the woody invasives like beautyberry and baccharis? Okay. It's funny because I just got an email yesterday about American Beautyberry, and I really haven't even had that question before, so it must be Year of the Beautyberry. Um, a lot of times, if you have serious woody invasives, it's going to be really tough to plant something vegetative like grasses and forbs and compete with that. So you're going to have some sort of brush management scheme added in to your restoration plan. So meaning you're going to have to stay on top of them to keep them down, and over time they will decrease. So we've showed that if you stay on brush regularly, then the amount you're investing in that brush management drastically goes down year to year. And so to start out, if you're going to plant like grasses and forbs wanting to compete with your baccharis, I think that's going to be a tough go. You're going to have to treat the brush first. That would be my game plan. But if you want to email me, I could give you a call and we could talk about your individual situation and what you were hoping to do with the property thereafter.
I see she's typing. As she types, let me say that thank you all for being here today. Our next session is going to be on May the 5th, preparing for mesquite and mixed brush herbicide applications. Our speakers are going to be Dr. Bob Lyons, and it's going to be one IPM CEU. Again, follow us on Facebook on our facebook.com/txrange. Looking forward to y'all being back.
Yeah, thanks
Any
for
other
participating.
any other questions?
If you think of something, feel free to email me or give me a good month or so, and hopefully we'll have this publication getting ready to come out on the AgriLife bookstore webpage. Thank you, Pete.
Thank you, Doc. Appreciate it.
I must have talked fast, huh?
You did great.